Okay, why don't we get started? So, welcome everyone. Good evening. First off, let me say we both appreciate, Mark and I both appreciate your flexibility in starting this at 7:30. Just remember that a couple of things. We're skipping next week, and then the final two sessions will be starting at 7 o'clock like the first one. But certainly thanks for the flexibility on this evening. I'm going to skip the lengthy intro bit. I think almost everybody has heard that last week. Just to remind you that use the Q&A button to send any questions or comments to me, which I'll relay to Mark. And one of the things that he would like to do, which is working well in the last several times we've tried it, is around the midpoint of the session, he'll take a pause and see if we get some reactions or comments or questions at that point from the audience before he then continues. So we'll do that around the midpoint. And one other thing, just to remind you all that the final session on June 30 is going to be in person in the Brubeck Room in the library. We will still stream it online for those of you who can't make it to the library. But we thought we'd try something, a little bit of an experiment now that some of the COVID stuff is getting a little more normal, to have it in person in the Brubeck Room and then a little reception afterwards where we can chat a little bit with each other and with Mark. So we'll keep you posted on that. And when we're a little closer, I will send you all an email from me just asking if you expect to be coming to the library that evening, just so that I have some idea of about how many people to expect. So with that, I'm turning it over to Mark. It's another great book. I finished it this morning, and I hope some of you had a chance to read it, and I'm looking forward to what he's got to say about it. Mark.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, as always, for inviting me to do the series, and I add my thanks to Michael for your flexibility, those of you who are here and agreed to come at 7:30. If we were in person, I would ask by show of hands how many people had read this novel before you read it for this evening. If you did, how many of you even heard of it? And I hope one thing that's clear, if you did attend this past spring's novels of modern American period, the Fitzgerald Faulkner books that we did, Edith Wharton, if you agree that last week's book, Call It Sleep, and this week's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, are so fundamentally different as novels from the novels we read of Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and so on. And part of that is because there's a radical change in the people who are expressing their views of American literature, American culture, of what it is to be an American. And necessarily they're using different means. So one of the remarkable things about this book, Michael, in our sort of green room conversation, described it as compact. It is indeed 20 chapters, short chapters. They cover many years of a woman's life, but a kind of interior life. It's not 200 pages in my edition. And it is a groundbreaking book, largely ignored until Alice Walker rediscovered not only Zora Neale Hurston's legacy, but her gravestone, and published an article about her in the 1970s in Ms. Magazine. So I want to say a little bit about placing the author and then talk about the book, and as always, read excerpts. But I'd be very eager at the halfway point to see what you have to say, less about me and my comments as about the book itself. So her dates are 1891 to 1960, and she was a folklorist and anthropologist as well as a novelist, wrote 4 novels, plays, memoirs, collections of folklore, more than 50 short stories, plays, and essays. She was a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance and one of the leading writers, more remarkable for being a woman writer. You look in vain for many novels by significant women, any stature, before this novel published in 1937. She was born in Alabama, but she was so proud of having moved with her family at the age of 3 to Eatonville, which figures in this novel and many of her novels, that she often lied in interviews and said she was born in Eatonville. It was one of the first all-Black towns incorporated in the United States in 1887, a few years before her birth. And when she was 6 years old, her father was elected mayor. And 5 years later, in 1902, he was called to serve as the minister of its largest church. So you see that some of what she writes about Joe Starks, for example, and some of her pride in that community and how he, that figure, rose in it. Not to say that Joe Starks is in any way based on her father. She graduated high school in 1918 at the age of 27 from the high school affiliated with Morgan State University. And she moved in 1925 to New York City, where she did important work in anthropology and ethnography while a student at Barnard, the only Black student at Barnard. She earned her BA there in 1928, and she later spent 2 years in Columbia working under the famed anthropologist Franz Boas by doing her research work, her field work in Harlem. She did not attend many classes, but she got a real education in listening to people tell their stories. And Boas's work was dedicated to making it clear that all cultures were relative. There was no better culture, no worse culture, and that a true anthropologist does not have a standard against which he and she is, or she is measuring other civilizations, other cultures. So that stood her in very good stead. It also put her in a position to have a very radically different view of the issue of the Negro, as it was said in the day, in America. I noted last time that Henry Roth's Call It Sleep was much more psychological than sociological as a novel. And we can say that her novel, very unusual in its day for more than one reason, not the least of which is it's written by a Black woman about a Black woman, was not so much political or sociology, but rather poetic and even mythic. There's a great mythical undertone, under framing, I'll say, to Call It Sleep, which is a bigger, busier novel, and those different sections with the coal give a kind of heft to it. This book does not have that kind of gravitas. It does not have that kind of epic length or depth. It is more nuanced. It's more lyrical. And you might describe her method as being poetic or even mythical. Certainly that great blossoming tree that appears early and recurs throughout the novel is an example of that. But she also set herself apart from some of the leading writers of the day, most especially Richard Wright, who would have been considered the leading African-American novelist in the 40s. She emphatically distanced herself from what writer and social critic Albert Murray called the myth of the African-American as a social science monster. That is, a creature to be seen only as a victim of racial oppression, whose culture is one of deprivation and whose role as the other, capital O, other, in American society casts the African Americans as criminals or pathological cases. That was a very common view of many people who were trying to help solve what some people called the Negro problem. She rejected what she called, and this is a quote, the sobbing school of Negrohood, who hold that somehow nature had given Black people a dirty deal. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit because it's significant to recognize how she was swimming against the culture of people trying to champion her race, how it affects her literature, and maybe part of why her legacy lay pretty inert for decades. She championed the idea of freedom as something internal. She described her own first novel, Jonah's Gourdvine, published 3 years before this one in 1934, as a manifesto, in her words, against the arrogance of whites who assume that black lives can only be lived in defiance to white actions. So when she said that it should be internal, she wrote that blacks must make their own emancipation. It has to be something inside you, your interior life. And for people as diverse as socialists and civil rights advocates and separatists who believe that the only solution to the Negro problem was for Africans to go back to Africa, and a movement that was called uplift ideology, championed especially by W.E.B. Du Bois, whose dates are 68 to 1963. So 1868, just after the Civil War, and lived long enough, nearly 100 years, to see the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. He was one of the founders of the NAACP. He believed that the solution to the Negro problem was for Black people to aspire to all the markers of class advantage: education, achievement, respectability. And he was at the different end of the spectrum from Booker T. Washington, who was born in slavery, unlike W.E. Du Bois, unlike Nora Zille Hurston, although all four of her grandparents were born in slavery. So when people were arguing Black people need to get money, and other people arguing Black people need to get class status, she was saying Black people need to heal themselves. And she said this based on her own view of the anthropological basis of Black culture, where she said too often, even Black people, again, she would have used the word Negroes, I'm just not comfortable with that in 2022, even they sometimes feel that their culture is childlike or inferior or too primitive in contrast to American white culture. Her background in folklore and anthropology, a professional anthropologist, suggested that there was a rich culture in song, in literature, in folklore, in myth, in religion. She did a treatise on hoodoo, hoodoo, hexing, that was equal in value to anything in American culture, white American culture. And because so many activists believed in activism, that is, we have to do something, the idea that you could change your sense of being oppressed by something internal, by something that you had to do as a change of heart, a change of mind, a change of spirit, was anathema to them, because they believed in political action of one kind or another. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that here we have a woman remarkable for the 1920s and 30s, practicing anthropology, writing 4 novels, of which this is the second, and being very interested in how individuals who are Black can find their own voice. And so one of the striking things about this novel as a text is that it merges speaking and writing, which would not be surprising for an author who's a professional anthropologist and folklorist. Anthropology can be done by observing silently what a society is like, but folklore almost always requires an investigation, including interviews, because so much folklore, especially in Black culture, is oral, O-R-A-L, and you can only learn of it by having someone tell you. So Henry Louis Gates has said that this work, this novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, enacts the project of finding a voice for any person, of coming into your own by finding your identity, by finding a voice. And he wrote that language is an instrument of injury, but also of salvation. Remember how she wounds her husband, Joe, by mocking his manhood. He beats her, and so does Tea Cake, But she does something that so undoes him that we're to understand that he's lost the will to live, embarrassing him in front of his friends and getting her revenge that way. So language as an instrument of injury and salvation, of selfhood and empowerment. And so we see that in the story, except for the first chapter and part of the last chapter, we're to understand that all the intervening 19 chapters or so is Janie telling her story to her friend Phoebe, who feels when it's over that she's taller than she was when it started, because she has heard this three-part story of a woman's life. Fiercely independent, but in every phase of her life until the end, married to a man, 2 unsuccessful marriages, one not really of her doing. She's married to a farmer and becomes a farmer's idea of property, basically a mule. She marries a charming, charismatic, entrepreneurial politician, Jody Starks, and becomes the property of such a man, which is a kind of trophy wife. He explicitly tells her to shut up. When he's campaigning, she's invited to talk. She had no intention of talking until she finds out that he won't let her talk. And so he's proud of her in a trivial way, in a superficial way, and she's silenced. And then finally, she makes her match with Tea Cake, also charismatic, a good deal younger, and finds sexual satisfaction that she first had an inkling of by looking at pollinating bees. And again, I'll read that in a moment. But the entire novel, in other words, is her history as being told to Phoebe. And although it uses the third person, Janie, when it tells the story, just as Call It Sleep uses David Sherrill in the third person. In both of these novels, the camera is on the shoulder of the protagonist. This is Janie telling her story through the third person / first person narrative. And I'll give you an example of that when we look at the section where she has the revelation at the age of 16 after she kisses Johnny Taylor over the gatepost. And it's that action seen by her grandmother that gets her married off to the old farmer, Logan Killix, because the grandmother now realizes she's marriageable, and to save her from illicit sex, she marries her off. But after she kisses him, or he kisses her, and in my edition, which you may or may not have, it's on page 10. In any other edition, it's a couple of pages into chapter 2, and it's a paragraph that begins, "She was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree." And in fact, the cover that I have illustrates that stretching out. She was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree. Remember, she's 16, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the bees, when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. The inaudible voice is one of those paradoxes that we all understand, that when we're communing with nature or another human being that we're close to, or an experience that seems to transcend the everyday, what I call the unreality of reality, it seems that we're hearing with a different set of organs. The inaudible voice of it all came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee. For those of you who haven't read this, that's a pollen-bearing bee covered with the dust of pollen, sink into the sanctum of a bloom. The 1,000 sister calyxes arch to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was marriage, exclamation point. That's Janie talking. Even though it says she at the beginning of that paragraph, this is a method in many narrations called the free indirect style. It's writing about her in the third person, but it's letting her voice slip in. And what she really means is this is copulation. This is sex. probably didn't think she could get away with that, but she got away with love embrace, ecstatic shiver, and creaming in every blossom, which is quite a bit to say. She'd been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Janie felt a pain, remorseless, sweet, that left her limp and languid, as if it's postcoital, as if she's just experiencing an orgasm herself. After a while, she got up from where she was and went over the little garden field entire. She was seeking confirmation of the voice and vision. Voice occurs a lot as a word in this novel. Joe likes that he has a big voice. He wants to be a big voice. And he feels stupidly that he has to silence his wife to have his voice be bigger. And everywhere she found an acknowledged answers, a personal answer for all other creatures except herself. She felt an answer seeking her, but where, when, how? She found herself at the kitchen door and stumbled inside. In the air of the room were flies tumbling and singing, marrying and giving in marriage. When she reached the narrow hallway, she was reminded that her grandmother was home with a sick headache. She was lying across the bed asleep, so Janie tipped out of the front door. Oh, to be a pear tree, any tree in bloom, with kissing bees singing of the beginning of the world. She was 16. She had glossy leaves and bursting buds, and she wanted to struggle with life, but it seemed to elude her. Where were the singing bees for her? Nothing on the place nor in Grandma's house answered her. She searched as much of the world as she could from the top of the front steps, and then went on down to the front gate and leaned over to gaze up and down the road, looking, waiting, breathing short with impatience, waiting for the world to be made. And it's at that time that her grandmother wakes up, sees that she's been kissed by this boy, that she's been lacerated by a kiss, and has exactly the wrong reaction, the exactly opposite reaction. This is not the beginning of a new world and new possibilities. This is the end of her maidenhood. She has to be saved, her virginity, by marrying her to an old farmer. But that image of the pear tree and the sense that there's something mystical about this, the inaudible voice of the buzzing of the bees covered in the dust of pollen as sex, animates her throughout the novel. Now, she doesn't go on some high-minded mission. She doesn't become a fiercely independent woman. She becomes the chattel of one man, the trophy wife of another. And then finally, she falls in love with a man where her love is so palpable that the people in town recognize it and acquit her of killing him. A remarkable outcome. You would not have predicted that he would get rabies, he would shoot at her, she would kill him, and she'd be vindicated by an all-white jury on the same day that she committed the act of self-defense. Just a remarkable novel. And I want to say again, I have great respect for the novels we did in the spring, or I wouldn't have done them. Those are world-class writers. But this kind of book and what I just read, you don't find in Edith Wharton or Sherwood Anderson, although it's closer to Sherwood Anderson, or Fitzgerald or Faulkner in their magnificent works, because this is now a Black woman writing about Black women, a Black woman in particular, from a set of tools that most novelists don't have. And that's one of the reasons why when Michael invited me to go forward, I said, we've got to do novels of the 30s. More of you are aware of Grapes of Wrath that we're talking about next time. Some of you may know the title of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, but not know that book. But two more books in the series that change the register of who's writing about America. And if you change who's writing about America, you change the America they're writing about. So we're at the top of the, I have to get used to saying top of the hour now, since we started at that. And I'll turn to Michael to ask if he wants to share anything from any of you who had comments.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, folks, so feel free to put some comments or questions into the Q&A box. I just wanted to mention, Mark, that as I was reading the book and as I was approaching the end of it, not the very end, not the last chapter, but as I was approaching the end of the book after the big event, the hurricane, I was feeling like I wanted it to be longer. Like I wanted it, I knew it was coming to an end and I wanted it to go longer. I felt like there were more things I wanted to know about Janie. I wanted to know more about what happens after all of this. But then actually, when I actually finished it, I didn't feel that way anymore. I felt that it really had wrapped itself up very, very nicely. And that's, I used the phrase with you earlier, Mark, about it being compact. It seemed like it was when I finished it, it seemed like it was the right length.
Oh, and I like that word compact. I've already quoted you about it. That's the quality of poetry. The key to poetry is its economy. It says much with very little, which is why it seems cryptic or elusive to some people. But if you don't have comments from anyone, I'm happy to keep talking, but I would maybe stop in another 10 minutes to see if people just want to register their reaction to reading or rereading this novel.
I just got a couple, just as
Very
you were
good.
speaking.
I'm not rushing you. Take your time.
Nope. The first one says, thought the book was phenomenal. Hurston is first great black feminist. The ending is ironic. Tea Cake dies as a result of what he experienced in trying to save Janie's life.
Yep.
And the second comment is, it struck me that Janie was, this is interesting. It struck me that Janie was never pregnant or became a mother, and motherhood would perhaps have changed her as it did her grandmother. Janie had no child to protect.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. It's also worth realizing that her grandmother gave birth to her daughter, Leafy, as a result of rape. And the same thing was true of Leafy giving birth to her daughter. And maybe there's a suggestion that there are other ways to live a life without that kind of sexual violence or procreation. Richard Wright felt that the novel was suffused with false or facile sensuality. And one of the things he had in mind about that pear tree is repeated again after she leaves Logan and marries Joe at the end of chapter 4. And the novel says a few, maybe 10 lines up, from now on until death, she was going to have flower dust, that is, she's marrying a younger man, and springtime sprinkled over everything, a bee for her bloom. Her old thoughts were going to come in handy now, but new words would have to be made and said to fit them. And there is this constant tension in the novel between the level of words, below that the level of thoughts, and below that the level of feelings, and how you find thoughts for your feelings. So one thought for her feeling is this metaphor of the tree and the blossom and the bee. But then what do you do when you try to explain that to someone else? New words would have to be made and set to fit them. And although I have a great respect for Richard Wright, I think he was so put off by this upstart woman writer and so put off by her theory that you could change your life internally and you didn't have to be part of a movement, that he just had a jaundiced view of her work. I don't think there's anything facile about the sensuality in this book. And I applaud her for being able to find a way in the 1930s to write about sexuality in such a moving way. Later on in my book, around page 40 and 41, is there the scene where she's invited to talk by the people at her husband's rally. And she's told, Joe tells the crowd that she is a woman and her place in her home. And then she's 24 years old. She's 7 years married. And this is in chapter 6. Jody slapped her. She was a good cook, and Joe had looked for, I'm on page 67. If you're in the same text that I am, I realize you might not be. I realize many of you may not have the book with you, which is fine. But if you want to check later or now to make sure I'm not making this up, near the bottom of page 67, Janie was a good cook, and Joe had looked forward to his dinner as a refuge from other things. So when the bread didn't rise, and the fish wasn't quite done at the bone, and the rice was scorched, he slapped Janie until she had a ringing sound in her ears, and told her about her brains before he stalked on back to the store. So I hope that not many of you have had this experience, but I'm sure some of you have had the experience of being slapped. And that, when you see movies and comedies, a slap seems a kind of comic thing, but a true slap on the head, not just one across your cheek, but on your head, done by a man in anger or frustration to a woman who presumably is smaller and not expecting it, is really a terrible act of violence, even if it didn't disorient you, but it does. Janie stood where he left her for unmeasured time and thought. She stood there until something fell off the shelf inside her. I think that's one of the most magnificent lines in this novel or any novel. She stood there until something fell off the shelf inside her. This again is the attempt for her to find words for what she's feeling, because the feelings are new. And you have to appreciate that this third person sentence, she stood there, is her telling Phoebe, I stood there until something fell off the shelf inside of me. But she puts it in a third person to give a distance and authority, to give a kind of novelistic feel to the story that Janie is telling. Then she went inside there, that is, she went inside herself to see what it was. It was her image of Jody tumbled down and shattered. But looking at it, she saw that it never was the flesh and blood figure of her dreams, just something she had grabbed up to drape her dreams over. In a way, she turned her back upon the image where it lay and looked further. So she's looking around her interior life. She had no more blossomy openings, dusting pollen over her mat, neither any glistening young fruit where the petals used to be. She found that she had a host of thoughts she had never expressed to him, and numerous emotions that she'd never let Jody know about. Things packed up and put away in parts of her heart where he could never find them. She was saving up feelings for some man she had never seen. She had an inside and an outside now, and suddenly she knew not how to mix them. That's magnificent. And it's magnificent because this is a woman trying to find a way to tell herself, and by extension, her friend Phoebe, and by extension, other women, especially other Black women, this experience that in marriage, you hope to find that your inside self and your outside self can be brought together with the man you married, or the woman you marry for that matter, but men have an advantage. Because what is marriage but a kind of public-private act? It's another person who you bring into your own self. And because she doesn't know that feeling, she doesn't have words to talk about it, she can only imagine what she's feeling about him, what she felt about him, as if he'd been a photograph on a mantle and he fell off a shelf. I want to pause for a moment because this is very delicate and very significant. When Hamlet is in his funk about whether he can do what he needs to do and kill his uncle to avenge his father, he spends many acts of the play asking if it is to be or not to be, not just himself. Can he do this thing? And he takes a long time to eventually does it, and does it kind of by default. But he is a man whose interior life is filled with these soliloquies. His debate is inside. In fact, Shakespeare has him say that in my heart, there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep, because Hamlet's a poet and he's a scholar. When Macbeth has the issue early in the play of whether he should kill a king, not at the request of his dead father, not to avenge a crime, but to create one, he's been told by the witches, take your time, you're eventually going to be the King of Scotland. And like many people, he can't wait for his number to be drawn, so he tries to help fate along. And of course, that's his doom. But he doesn't have an interior debate. He says, is this a dagger that I see before me? He imagines in his frustration and nervousness a kind of hologram, a kind of video of the dagger that he's going to use to kill Duncan. That's because he's not a poet, he's not a scholar, he's a warrior. And so he doesn't feel inside, there's no shelf inside of Macbeth from which something could have fallen. For him, he can only imagine it as an external video. He's got to see the PowerPoint. I'm being quite serious here. It shows you the difference between him as a person and Hamlet. To go back to Janie, she doesn't have an external reference other than the tree. And she doesn't have a way to talk about her feelings poetically the way Hamlet would, her feelings for her husband. So for her, it's a picture that she honored that is now broken. And to find it, she has to go inside herself. And in going inside herself, she realizes there's a gap between the inside me and the outside me. It's very moving, very delicate. I hope you see how impressive it is. Those of you who have raised children know that one of the things my granddaughter is now nearly 3 years old, that children have to struggle with is the inside voice and the outside voice, how they can be in their family where it might be quite appropriate as a 2.5-year-old to dance naked in front of men and women, but you can't do that in pre-K or on the street or at your friend's house. And to get the sense of what's the outside self, what's the inside self. There are many passages like that where Janie's power of imagination, her power of aspiration are so strong, but her ability to express it is compromised, is underdeveloped. So I'll stop for another moment, Michael, as I promised, to see if people want to weigh in.
Well, here's a question and a comment. How do you think Hurston considered her audience? Janie is a character that it is difficult to, so to speak, acquire, depending on the reader's life experience. I had to work at it quite a bit, but it was worth it.
Is that the end of it?
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's always a very difficult question, even for people who are experts in a particular author, and I don't pretend that I am. I have a lot of admiration. I've read a number of her books. I've read her autobiography. But I imagine she had a sense of who her audience would be from having lived in New York, in Harlem, having worked as a ethnographer in New York City, working with Boas in Columbia and Harlem, of living in Eatonville, the town that she moved to, that she claimed as her birth town, is the town where this novel is set. I have to think that she spoke to many people, men and women, and she had to imagine that those were the people that would be reading this book, that would be reading the book. The flowering of Black culture in the Harlem Renaissance gave an audience for jazz. If you look up Harlem Renaissance, you'll see people like Louis Armstrong listed alongside other writers and artists. An enormous cultural resurgence that I think provided an audience. And I have to think she was thinking of those people, the people that she was inquiring of, she was now informing. And I want to say again, there's a novel from the 1920s by a male author named Jean, Jean Toomer, Toomer, called Cain. That's probably the best known novel by an African American, but again, it was a male. And for the 1930s to have a novel of this power written by a Black woman who was not a woman who herself had experienced slavery. Even her childhood was in a thriving community where her father was a mayor and a minister. A lot of dignity in her own past, but gathered through her interviews, lots of examples of people whose lives were so deprived that they found solace in the songs, the stories, the myths that they told in the ethnographic work that she did. You know, part of what voodoo is, it's a way in which people who don't feel empowered can use their belief in the spiritual world to enact change. It wasn't all about sticking pins in people. It was about getting the supernatural forces to change your life now. And it's the belief of people who feel they're disenfranchised. Maybe magic will make things happen that the real world won't do on its own. Very poignant, I think. So I have more to read, but I'm going to ask you any more comments, Michael, before I move
Yeah,
on?
yeah, I have
Yeah.
a few more comments. Um, Part of Hurston's achievement is showing us the portrait of a satisfied adult. Janie's life is impoverished in every external way, but she has loved completely, and that is enough.
Yes. So I want to say that, there is this pattern before the thing happens with the tree. It says 3 days have passed. And of course, her story has three parts, the three husbands. And there's a clear progression that the first is a marriage that she had nothing to do with. The second is somebody she married willingly, and he turned out to not be what she wanted. His image got broken inside her. And the third man was far from perfect. He steals from her. He gambles away money. He's something of a womanizer. He has a party and doesn't invite her. He hits her as well. And I think that's partly a candid recognition that that kind of interaction was very common, not just among Black couples of a certain class, but many people of all races of a certain class in that period in American history of a man feeling that he had the right to slap or beat his woman. It is hardly a marriage made in heaven, except they adore each other. And I think it's a testament to how strong their love is that people recognize she wouldn't have killed him if she had any other choice. And when his friends are alienated from her for a short time because she killed Tea Cake, even they come around and recognize she wouldn't have killed him if she didn't have a choice. And I think that the hurricane, which is an actual 1928 hurricane in Florida that was one of the deadliest, that they would have ignored the warnings that such a thing could have happened of a rabid dog biting Tea Cake in the face when he's trying to kill it, his becoming rabid, and her having the unfortunate consequence of having to kill the thing she loves. But when you consider that all of this has happened to her before the first chapter where she tells Phoebe her story. So when she's telling Phoebe about the flowering fruit tree in chapter 2, she's already lived the 40 years of her life that includes having to kill the man she loved. It's remarkable that there's no bitterness in her tale, that there's no sentimentality, that there is candor and absolutely credible human emotion. In the same way that I believe in the reality of David Sherrill, who only exists by characters on a page, I believe in Janie Crawford as somebody who actually exists. It's a great accomplishment.
Great
So
comment.
I want to read, I see we've got about 12 more minutes. So when she's talking about starting over with another marriage with Tea Cake, and this is at the end of chapter 12, telling Phoebe that she decided she would marry him. It says on the bottom of, again, my page 108, but a page before the end of chapter 12, if you're in another edition. She says, because tea cake ain't no Jody Starks. And if you tried to be, it would be complete flummox. But the minute I marries him, everybody is going to be making comparisons. So us is going off somewhere and start all over in tea cake's way. This ain't no business proposition and no race after property and titles. That's what Jody wanted. Business, entrepreneurial, political stuff. He had a big voice. He wanted success. This is a love game. I done live grandma's way, and I mean to live mine. Well, grandma's way was to marry Logan. And Phoebe says, what do you mean by that, Janie? And she says, Janie, she was born in slavery time when folks, that is Black folks, didn't sit down anytime they felt like it. So sitting on porches like the white madam looked like a mighty fine thing to her. That's what she wanted from me. Don't care what it cost. Get up on a high chair and sit there. She didn't have time to think what to do after you got up on the stool and do nothing. The object was to get up there. I'm going to stop for a moment to say, this is very powerful to me, that in her grandmother's time, it was just enough to be able to sit down when and where you wanted. So I got up on the high chair like she told me, but Phoebe, I done nearly languished to death up there. I felt like the world was crying extra, the way a paperboy does. And I ain't read the common news yet. That is, I'm supposed to feel rewarded that my grandmother got me a husband, and now I'm the lady of the house. Well, not in Logan's point of view. She's like a mule in the field. But I'm supposed to think I'm successful because I got married. Many young women in many ages of history were bred to think that was success. And for her grandmother, it was enough to be there because she was born in slavery and she had a different definition of life and freedom and success. To be able to sit down where you wanted was a great gift. But Janie was born differently and has a different way, and she wants her marriage to be different. And as she says, if she were just sitting on that chair, it would be like the world was crying extra, extra, and I haven't even read the regular news yet. I'm missing out on something. It's not enough just to be on the chair. I have to have a fuller life. But the poignancy, the poetry of how she expresses it to a friend who is kind of her confidant is very compelling. And one of the glories of the book.
And one of the comments that came in just before that was that she says Janie is such a triumphant character, but Nora herself died in poverty and unknown.
Yeah, and young. She alienated some people again with her stance. I think in many cases they didn't know what to do with her. American culture, especially in the 30s and 40s, it was not good at what to do with successful women. I'm not sure we're still good at that. We're good at that yet, but even among other Black intellectuals and writers, she and Langston Hughes, who got along for a while, collaborated on a play together, and they had a falling out over who should get the rights for having written most of it. And it was never produced in their lifetime, and they stopped being friends. For novelists, the fact that you have the skills of an anthropologist doesn't take you very far. And I imagine that other than Boas, who was very well disposed to her, Franz Boas, B-O-A-S, I imagine that among her colleagues at Columbia, who were in the anthropology or ethnography department, being a published novelist didn't go very far, although that came later. She really bridged two different worlds. I recommend to you that first novel that I cited. And I also want to say that a splendid read if you have interest in her as a person, not just on her writing, Give me a second, I'll find the page I'm looking for. So that first novel is Jason's Gourd Vine, but she published a collection of folklore in 1935, Mules and Men, which brought her to the attention of intellectuals. That's 2 years before their eyes were watching God. And she has an excellent autobiography that I recommend to you, published in 1942, called Dust Tracks on a Road. Dust Tracks on a Road, where you'll learn a lot about her as a person. I think a remarkable woman. But yes, it's true. Janie had a kind of success. Hurston was herself married 3 times, married and divorced twice. But some of that happened after the novel, so she wasn't writing from her own. She wasn't writing a fictional version of herself. I have so many places in this book where I'm struck by the economy and poetry of the language. When she realizes that Jody is not the man she thought he was, and still is married to him, but loses her love for him. It says that now, sometimes, this is the beginning of chapter 7, first paragraph, sometimes she's stuck out into the future, imagining her life different from what it was. That is, hoping. But mostly she lived between her hat and her heels. Now, it may be that that's an expression that was well known to other people in the 1930s. I myself don't know if there's anyone here tonight of the 60-something people here who knows that. I'd be glad to know. It may be that it's an expression that comes from her background in Florida or from the African-American experience, but whether it's original to her or whether it was something she picked up from her study or experience or life, what a great statement for not having the ability to hope beyond the present, living between your hat and your heels. And it says that because of that, she didn't read books. This is the bottom of page 72. So she didn't know that she was the world and the heavens boiled down to a drop. She's an individual in the world, man attempting to climb to painless heights from his dunghill. Then one day she sat and watched the shadow of herself going about tending store and prostrating itself before Jody, while all the time she herself sat under a shady tree with the wind blowing through her hair and her clothes, somebody near about making summertime out of lonesomeness. So this is when she's still married but has no love for Jody. And where we saw earlier, she went inside herself to rummage around, looking for the bee pollen and seeing the broken image of the man she loved. Here, she's outside herself in a very negative way. She's watching the shadow of herself like a ghost, tending store and prostrating itself before Jody, while all the time in her imagination, in her mind, in her interior life, she's under a shady tree with the wind blowing through her hair and her clothes. This is not, you might as well call it sleep. This is not Henry Roth's idea that as a burgeoning artist, writer, even as a young boy, he can use his imagination for transcendence. She is a broken woman who realizes the life she has with her man, which was supposed to be a life of blossoming and bee pollen. It doesn't have to be procreation, but it has to be love and sex, this natural thing. She's a split personality now. She said in the passage where she's inside herself, looking at the broken image, there was an inside her and an outside her. Now it becomes even more extreme when she's just a ghost. She sees herself as a kind of out of body experience. Karl Marx talked about alienation as a modern phenomenon connected to the psychology of capitalism, that when you were a worker who made a product in your home or on your farm, or you were a farmer, or you cultivated flowers and maybe sold them at a roadside stand. You were your work in a healthy way. What you were, who you were, and what you did were integrated, and you had a kind of happiness, the way people take pride in their family or their town or the things they make or do. But when the product you make has nothing to do with you, when you're on an assembly line or you're in an office tallying up numbers, and what you do has nothing to do with who you are, that dissociation of selves is what Marx called alienation. You are strange even to yourself, and it's beginning of a kind of modern crisis, a kind of modern mental illness. And Freud was working the same field on the other side of the street with this notion of split sensibility, of dissociation of who you are. And that's what she's experiencing there. I'm going to stop there just to say that remarkable in the story that it tells, remarkable in the creativity of not having it be a terrible arranged marriage, then a pretty good marriage for a time, and then a really happy ending marriage at the end. They're all fraught in different ways. There is clearly a progress. She is in the unfortunate circumstance, as often happens in tragedies, that you kill the thing you love. In a plot device that some people have found gimmicky, I find perfectly believable. And the remarkable thing is not just that she's acquitted, although that's remarkable, but that she's whole at the end of the story and not a traumatized woman, even with all she's been through. She's not going to dress for that last funeral because she's too filled with grief to dress for grief. That's a brilliant line. It's like the person who doesn't care what they're wearing to a loved one's funeral because they're too brokenhearted to care. Hamlet says a similar thing, that his clothes can't reveal the pain he feels for the death of his father. So I'll stop there because we're out of time, Michael, and just repeat my thanks. I'm very grateful, even though I can't see you all. I hope to see you when we meet for the last session, and very grateful for the change in time, which made my life today quite a bit easier. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mark. Another great presentation on a really interesting, excellent book that I had not heard of. I think I might have heard of the title, certainly hadn't read before last week. Great choice. Thanks, everybody, for attending, and again, with the flexibility on the start time. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks with Grapes of Wrath as the focus. And remember, in 2 weeks, we're also going to start at 7, like last week. So a good evening, everybody. Thanks, and we'll see you all again soon.
Stay well, everybody. Stay well. Bye, Michael.
Good night, Mark.